Hello, and thank you so very much again for joining us. And today we have, as we said before, Professor Loredana, we are extremely grateful for her time and joining us. Hello, Professor. It's lovely for
Hi.
you to join us.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's so before we get started, we kind of gave a little bit of introduction about you. But before we get into the real, discussion, please tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, of course, and just a bit of background to everybody.
First of all, thank you for having me. I'm calling you from Boston. It's the first time in a long time that we have a sunny day, so I'm taking advantage of the sun. But yeah, my name is Loredana Padurean. I'm an associate professor at Northwestern University at the business school, the Moore McKim, and I'm also a lecturer at MIT Sloan. I just returned to Boston 8 months ago. I was a senior associate dean at an MIT startup built in Malaysia called Asia School of Business, where I was there for about 8 years. So yeah, this is a little bit who I am, Loredana Padurean. Just call me Loredana, it's enough.
Loredana, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Sam. That's lovely. So we'll get into, of course, what you did in your absolute, amazing career. But before we get into it, this is a question we always ask. Tell us of your first book of choice that you've chosen to tell us about, and a book that has made an impact on your life.
So I always have a very hard time with this question when somebody asks me to choose one book. And I was thinking, actually, if we think about what really informed my life as a younger person, I will tell you more that instead of one book, it was more of an experience and a process. I'll tell you later a little bit more about myself, but I grew up in communism. And one of the typical things during the regime was that we didn't have access to information. We didn't have TV networks, we didn't have channels, we didn't have media, and we had very, very few books. And books were probably one of the most valuable commodity. And I was very, very lucky that my mother's best friend was the bookstore manager. We only had a bookstore in the entire town, and she was the manager of the bookstore. And I was extremely lucky that every single time we would get a new book, like literally it was a handful of books that were, released maybe once a month, once every 2 months. She always put aside pretty much everything she got in the inventory for me. So I want to talk about this rather than a book, because for me, learning or reading from a book was almost a guilty pleasure, but not guilty in the sense of the way you eat ice cream, but in a sense of an illegitimate pleasure, almost like an illegal pleasure, something that you had very hard access to. So it became a very valuable experience. It became a very rare experience, and an experience that you had to cherish. And I still remember, the sense of smell has a huge impact on the memory. And I still remember today my mother coming home from work at 3:30 every afternoon, and she would call me before and she'd say, guess what, I have a book. And I remember just opening the book and smelling the book, because it was such a rare smell and such a rare experience. And she knew that from 3:35 onwards, you couldn't talk to me until I finished the book. So like I said, maybe you're disappointed in this answer because I don't have a book, but I pretty much read anything that was published. And I remember reading Madame Bovary when probably was way too young for me to read Madame Bovary, and sort of experiencing this idea that life could be wasted unless you're very careful. I was obsessed with Greek mythology, which I think opened my mind to a lot of, believe it or not, the Greek mythology was extremely inclusive, very, very tolerant of diversity, very unconventional in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember reading Shogun at least 20 times, and it was, I think, the thicker book that was ever published up to that point. So like I said, for me, reading was not something that you had to do, but it was a rare and very valuable pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you. That was an amazing answer, I think. The whole point of this podcast is to think about what drives us, why we do what we do, and our childhood is, of course, a starting point, put the foundation to what we do. So, you know, I couldn't think of a better example to start off with, right? So what you just mentioned. So thank you. That was amazing. So you mentioned just now that, you know, you were growing up in a kind of a communist environment, or a communist country, as it were, not environment, communist country, communism. And so what was growing up like? How was that? I mean, a lot of people probably, well, many people at this day and age probably can't imagine that, younger
Yeah.
people. So how was that?
Well, it was interesting when I look back now, and you know, had I had the choice, probably I wouldn't wanted a childhood like that. But so something specific of a communist regime is the need for uniformity and the need for you know, uniformity in thought, in expression, in you know, physical expression, emotional expression, intellectual expression. So it was this idea that there's a uniform society. There's no highs, there's no lows. Everybody has the same salary. Everybody has the same food. Everybody has the same cars. Everybody has the same access to everything. And that's the utopian aspect of communism. The dystopian aspect is that humans are not made for such a system, and no matter how hard you try, everybody's going to want to be different than others. And I try very hard to be different. But I was very young during communism. I was still in middle school when it ended in 1989. And what I remember about it was this extreme. It wasn't even extreme poverty, which it was extreme poverty, but it was extreme limitation to knowledge, and a very, very intense sort of intense presence of control of information, of media, of books, like I said before. And what's interesting about humans is no matter in what situations you throw them, they will find ways to revolt. They will find ways to try to break the system.
Yeah.
I think, for example, the fact that we didn't have access to a radio station, for example, or to a TV. We didn't, I mean, we had TV, but we didn't have networks. And I remember my parents and my neighbors trying to makeshift satellite dishes to try to access BBC, for example. And when BBC was playing on the radio, there was no people on the street because BBC was at 7 o'clock, and they had a Romanian broadcast at 7 o'clock from London, specifically made for sort of like the underground movement. And I think there's many things that I can talk about communism, but related to your podcast, I think what was really interesting was to see that despite the fact that you had a system that tried to sort of, you know, damp the need for learning and the need for knowledge, people were desperate to find ways to learn. They were exactly they were getting very creative about finding ways to learn. You know, we didn't have books, but we had a book sharing process where you started the book and then you would pass it to somebody else. We didn't have access to radio and TV, but people were making out of literally pots. They were making makeshift satellite dishes to get access to information. We didn't have newspapers, but every now and then you would have a relative coming from abroad and they would bring a magazine, and the magazine would be passed on through the entire community. So there's I'm going to look at the resilience more than the you know, the entire trauma of the communism. But I think more than anything, it taught us how to be resilient and frugal, and probably very respectful of access to information.
Yeah. I mean, something that we take for granted, but you know, it's like I don't know, like oxygen, right? You know, it's something that is already there. We don't really care. It's there, right? But if you don't have it, you know, you really feel the need for it, and you really crave it, and you might even the decisions that you're making is completely affected by it. So it's a very interesting problem. But at the same time, at this day and age, people are worried about having too much information about, and maybe the wrong kind of information, or if it's true, correct, this kind of problems. But the other opposite of that is having not enough or at all, right? So you make up your own kind of things, which is not exactly the. So
I mean, no matter how much information you have, people will find ways to craft it around their needs or around their preferences. But I remember, like I said, when I was a very young child, most people would measure their success or wealth by how many books they had in the library, in their own bookstore.
That's so lovely.
So we would visit, let's say, neighbors or friends or people in another city. And I remember my parents or the adults in the room, the first thing they would notice is how many books that person had access to. And you could always tell that that person was valuable by how many books he had. And it's interesting. I haven't thought about that, Shirosh, in 25 years, 30 years, ever since I was a kid. But I remember specifically, have you seen their bookstore? Have you seen their bookshelf? Have you seen their bookstore?
That is incredible. Like these days, people still look at, have you seen their Benz or their car or whatever it is, right? So now it's completely, that's amazing. So you've kind of grown up with that background, and then you've somehow, I mean, you obviously, didn't make, you didn't make it that a hindrance to you. You kind of, went beyond that. And, even though your childhood may have had it, until 1989, I think, isn't it? You had the communism, and after that it fell. But and then you kind of went through the schooling process, or your education process, and then you kind of went up all the way to doing your master's. What was that journey like?
So a lot of the life decisions that one takes are also very, influenced by historical context, if the historical context is very tumultuous. And in my case, the thing with communism, it was because of the need for uniformity. There was no question about what are you going to do with your life. There was a decision-making process was not yours. Somebody else would take it. And all of a sudden, post-communism, now people they realized that they had a lot more options, but they were also very confused about the options they had, because we didn't have muscles trained for optionality, right?
Right.
If you never think that you have options, you don't build this muscle. So or maybe 3 or 4 jobs that were, desirable during communism, and that's what you were trained for, which is very typical,
doctor,
athletes were very, very well regarded in those days, or being a professor. But post-communism, all of a sudden the world opened up, but also what opened up was a lot of confusion. So I would say the first years of my very young adulthood were very confusing years for me, because all of a sudden there were new flavors of jobs that I have never heard of before. And also there was another reality, which is in most countries that are transitioning from one type of, political system to another, you're going to have a lot of economic and social instability. So Romania was going through a lot of economic instability. I remember I was in college full-time, and I had 3 full-time jobs while I was a full-time student, because the financial crisis that my country was going through was so intense that even 3 full-time jobs would not pay for a rent. I'm sorry. So the salary of 3 full-time jobs would not even pay for a rent. So it wasn't for the longest time, I didn't really have questions about, not questions, I didn't have a clarity about what I want to do, because it was either a lot of confusion because the world was all of a sudden very different, or the poverty and the sort of economic system was so limiting that all you had to do was survive. So, I got a bachelor degree, but I got a bachelor degree in international relations only because sort of it was like the new thing to do. And everybody thought post-communism, Romania is going to have a high need for international relations. It turns out nobody really gave a damn. And then when I graduated from college, by then I had at least 16 different jobs in very different places, in very different fields. And I started my own startup, even though back in the days we didn't use the word startup, and pretty much I created my own venture because I couldn't get a job. I wanted to glorify a little bit this aspect, like, oh, everybody's an entrepreneur. In my case, I was an entrepreneur because there was no other option. I couldn't find a job. And it turns out that I was pretty good. I was very creative, and I had a lot of bright ideas. And my business partner, who's today still my best friend, we were very good at creating opportunities, but we didn't really know about the business side of a business. So after about 2 years of trying to figure out what we want to do, I realized that maybe I need to go back to school, and maybe I need to go to school with a lot more respect for what I plan to study. Because like I said, my bachelor was just a random choice. And it was also very distracted by the entire, economic and political and social crisis. So then I thought, okay, I'm going to make an intentful decision and go back and get a master's degree. And that master's degree is going to give me the knowledge that I don't have today to become an entrepreneur. I think that was always the narrative, that I'm going to become an entrepreneur. So I ended up going to Switzerland, and I went to Switzerland for 2 reasons. One, because there was always this, Switzerland has this, had this brand of being a very, very advanced country when it comes to education. But I also got a chance to go to a brand new school. It was a state school, but I was, I think, the founding class of the graduate program. And it was a very entrepreneurial environment, being brand new, but also because it was very entrepreneurial, I actually got myself a job being both a student and then a program manager. So that gave me access to understanding the business of education, not just, the education of business. So that was interesting. I did that.
I think when you say school here, just for everybody from this side of the pond, we're talking about university, not a school. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
A university. It was a university. I had obviously an undergrad degree, a couple of master programs. So I did that for 2 years. It was a 2-year MBA, master's program. We didn't have an MBA. And part of the master's was a semester of research. So we had to write a thesis. And I was very annoyed by the idea that I have to sit down and write. It was 120 pages. So there was a minimum of content. But through the process of writing the thesis, and I chose a very specific subject, a very applied subject, something that I was doing in my job as a program manager for the university. Through this process, I discovered that I have a more inquisitive mind than I thought when it comes to academic research. I wasn't very excited about, to be honest, about the methodology. I wasn't very excited about the statistical analysis, but I was very excited about the discovery process. And at that point, my academic advisor, who was the dean, said, "You have the prerequisite for a PhD student." And I said, "What's that prerequisite?" He said, "Curiosity. The most important thing for a successful PhD student is to be curious. And I think you should stay and be a PhD student." And I thought it was laughable. I really thought it was the most ridiculous thing I ever heard, because maybe this is why representation truly matters. But the standard model that I had in my head about what an academic is, what a professor is, with all due respect to all my colleagues, was an older, mostly white man who would sit at the desk, read from a textbook in the least exciting and engaging manner. Now, I had a couple of exceptions in my career, but they were so few and so in between that sort of the thread line was, this is what an academic looks like. And I thought, I don't want to be an academic. I can't see myself doing this. So I completely rejected the idea. Like I said, I wanted to be an entrepreneur. My plan was to find a way to become more successful than I was the first time. But yeah, I got this opportunity to be a PhD student.
It's a very a decision that you made with intent, right? You didn't like think, let's do just PhD or let's go to industry, but you made a decision really thinking about it.
No, I didn't. Actually, I didn't.
You didn't. Oh, right. Okay.
I didn't. I mean, I did and I didn't. So this was the decision-making process. And maybe people who are listening to you, you can understand that sometimes opportunities come to your way and you're completely unprepared for that. And they might hit you, out of the blue. So like I said, it was a very new university, and we actually didn't have a PhD program, or it was a very, very early stage PhD program. And I was going to be the first PhD of my program, the first PhD student of my program. And the reason why I accepted it was it came with a very very significant grant with a very significant scholarship. And for somebody who grew up extremely poor, money was money. It was like, all right, I guess I have a job. I looked at the PhD program as I have a job, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And because the university was so young and they didn't have an established PhD program, my grant came with the freedom to go pretty much anywhere I want in the world, who would allow me to spend some time in their university and learn from them. Yeah. And so I was very bold, and I said, okay, I'm going to go and try to find the best. And my goal was to go to MIT. For me, MIT was always sort of like the gold standard. And I remember telling my colleagues that I'm going to try to see if anybody at MIT would allow me to hang out. And they laughed at me. They said, who do you think at MIT is going to pay attention to you? I remember this specific man telling me, you little girl. And I was like, well, we're going to have to try. And I was very lucky that one professor said yes. And I came to MIT, and I spent about 3 months at MIT, sort of hanging around, attending workshops, talking to PhD students, trying to see what courses might be interesting for me. And after my 3 months stay at MIT, which was, I think we're talking exactly January of 2008, I think, I decided that this is not for me. I'm actually it's the wrong path. I don't want to do a PhD. Because this idea that I have to sit down for years and write and do research, and not even doing research, but publishing a very hard, with a lot of effort produced work, would create such a little impact. It just didn't sit well with me. I was like, really, I'm gonna spend 3 years to write a paper, and then it's gonna be read by a few peers, all due respect to the peers, but it's gonna have so little impact in my network, in my community. It didn't make sense.
What's the point? Yeah, exactly.
I was like, the economics don't line up. So I went to my MIT advisor, Professor Charles Fine, and I said, dude, I'm out. This is not for me. I'm gonna go back, give back the money, and I want to do something meaningful. I want to do something actionable. I want to do something entrepreneurial. And Charlie said, MIT is very famous for action learning, but it's also famous for action research. Maybe you should do an action research PhD. And I was like, what is an action research PhD? He said, well, there's, in the world of engineering, the world of science, medicine, think about it. PhDs have to run experiments. They live in labs. They create things. They test things. They build prototypes. In the world of management, it's a little bit harder because I can't go to your company and be like, hey, would you let me run an experiment? You can, but it's not that easy.
Yeah.
And I think you should take an action research approach to your project, because obviously you're somebody who needs to be in the midst of action. You need hands-on experience. So I was very intrigued by that. I was like, interesting. So I can do both. I can both learn through action. I can learn through studying, and then I can also create impact, because that was also one of my things. So I was very lucky that I was best friends with a colleague of mine from Switzerland who was also part of the master's program, and he was planning to become an entrepreneur. And together we have identified a bankrupted business, a bankrupted ski resort in Switzerland, and we took it over. And it was part of my thesis. We turned it around as a business, but it was part of my thesis. And under 3 years, I defended and got my PhD. And the thing is, the entire time I was doing my PhD, I was actually living in this community, literally in the middle of nowhere, at 2,400 meters in Switzerland, a population of, at that point, were 37 octogenarians. I think the average age was 74. I was surrounded by goats and cheesemakers and hunters, and I don't ski. I hate mountains. I hate winter. It wasn't a passion of mine at all. It was, my business partner was very passionate about the alpine industry, but I didn't know anything about it. But we ended up running a hotel, a restaurant, a ski, the cable cars. So the entire ski resort was under our purview. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot through research, because we built a very unique business model and a very unique research model called destination governance, which nobody had done in action up until that point. We actually ended up presenting a WTO, so it was a really nice venture. But I also learned a lot about the reality of working in a business environment, because as a PhD student, we are in a way sheltered because we only learn through secondary data, right? And I remember reading a lot about the things that I should be doing, and the reality of doing them was very different.
Yes, yes.
And that was a very formative reflection for me, that let's not glorify research, let's not glorify theory, but also let's not glorify practice, because they're equally hard and they equally have to coexist and complement each other. So I always hated this idea of an ivory tower that most universities sort of live by, and the disinterest in industry. And I never really understood that it was always considered to be lowbrow if you were very industry centric as a PhD. And I thought that's a bunch of bullshit, because at the end of the day, my job is to create positive change and positive value. My job is not to just write another paper that, once again, with all due respect to the peers, the only people that will benefit from is somebody who needs to quote somebody who's doing some similar kind of research. So anyway, that was my PhD story.
No, it was lovely. I was just thinking about my experience as a PhD student, as well as some of the things happened after I finished my PhD. So I could relate to a lot of the things that you just said, right? So about working in industry, working in how that really makes an impact. And one other thing I really thought about was that actually you didn't just write while you're writing a PhD. I think you were actually doing the beds, you were cleaning the hotel, all the things that you would write. So it's as far as
it teaches you a lot of humility. It teaches you that
right.
Running a business is not as glamorous as it seems. Being an entrepreneur is not as glamorous as it seems. I remember specifically this event. It was New Year's Eve, and we had a full house and we had a big party. And at some point, the waitress comes to me and says, "Boss, we ran out of all the linen and I need fresh linen." And I was like, "So what should I do?" She said, "Go in the basement, start doing laundry and start ironing linen." So I called my business partner, and we were at midnight while people were kissing outside and fireworks were going. We were ironing linen. And I looked at him and I said, "Was this what you wanted when you say you want to be an entrepreneur?" Because that's not what I thought we're going to do. And you're right. We ended up, I learned how to be a cook, a chef. I learned how to do rooms. I was a cleaning lady. I was a marketing director. I was a spokesman. I was, I was, you name it, we did it, because that was the reality of running a startup. And later on, when entrepreneurship became sort of my area of expertise as an academic, once again, I have a much higher level of respect and understanding and humility for what it takes to be an entrepreneur. Right. You can't really wear white gloves and be like, somebody should be doing that. Well, guess what? That somebody's you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the theater of plate spinning, right? That's what that is. So you have to keep going. So it's incredible, like the story, right? And so you finished your PhD with incredible time, 2.5 years. That's, especially for a PhD that you did.
3 years. It was 3 years without 3 weeks. But to be honest, I finished it so quickly because I just couldn't take it anymore. So it was hard to recover a business from bankruptcy, to bring it back to where it is, to write the thesis, to go to conferences, publish papers, fight with traditional academics who would say that action research is bullshit. Yeah. So it was only through the sheer force of my intense personality that I think my academic advisor said, "All right, fine.
You can have your done.
You're qualified." Yes. Get out of the way.
So that's brilliant. And then so you finished your PhD. What did you? This is the question that everybody gets, right? Yeah. So you've done your PhD. You had, before you did your PhD, you thought, should I be doing your PhD? And then once you finish your PhD, you had to make a decision. Should I go to industry? Should I get a job, have a cushy job, nice job, or should I go down this path, which is going to be much more the same of what I did, maybe even more intense, more different, right? So how did you make the decision? Which is a fork in the road, really?
So before I did my PhD, I remember I told you that I was a program manager for the school. And the way that happened was, like I said, because the university was very young, they were hiring students as, administrators because they didn't have enough staff. And as part of my job as a program manager was to manage my peers pretty much, and the students coming after my class. And a couple of times I had to go in front of them and give talks and sort of present the new program or things like that. And then I got very much the bug of public speaking. That was my first thing. And then as a PhD student in our university, we were not allowed to teach as a PhD student. But again, I have a pretty intense personality. We also didn't have that many PhD students. So I bugged until finally they allowed me to teach one course. And they gave me the worst rated course in the master's program, which was research methods. And they're like, all right, take this one, because it was already very badly rated by the students. Who the hell gets excited about research methods if you're a master's student? And by the time I finished teaching it, it was top 3 most rated student class courses, which is a big deal because I was competing with organizational behavior and, leadership, which are always very popular courses. And I thought, if I can teach research methods as a PhD student and it's so well received, I think I found my calling.
Calling, right? Your passion, yeah.
And like I said, I had so many jobs prior to this. I worked in constructions, in media, I worked in fashion, I worked in television, I worked in sales, I worked in marketing, I worked in insurance. I've done a lot, but none of the experiences that I had, with the exception of television. Television was also something that I really enjoyed. It didn't give me that instant validation that being in front of an audience, in front of students, it gave me. So I decided to be a professor. But I think where the decision is complicated for a young PhD is, do you want to play the game or not? In the sense that you have to realize that academia today is still a very old school system, where the publish or perish is the DNA of our entire industry. Yeah. And I was like, I'm not very excited about that. Let's be very honest. My papers were good, but I didn't pursue the path of publishing, and this idea of having to write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite until every single line has been approved by, whatever, that didn't excite me at all. And that was my weakness. That was my biggest weakness, that I didn't have the patience and I didn't have the respect for the process. I'll be very honest. But my strength was that even as a young assistant professor, I was extraordinary in class. I was so good that in the first semester, I got called in the dean's office to tell me that my teaching ratings are suspiciously high. I was very confused. I was like, I'm sorry, how is that a problem? She said, well, we don't usually see teaching ratings so high, especially from a young faculty. And we want to know, are you in cahoots with the students? And I thought that was very...
Yeah, disrespectful. But yeah, that's not cool. Yeah.
Because I put so much into my craft, into my teaching craft, and I was a terrible researcher, or I'm not sure I was terrible, but I wasn't interested. But I was a very, very good teacher. And I'm not trying to be modest, falsely modest here, or arrogant, but the reality is, by this age, you should know what you're good at and what you're not good at. And I was putting all my efforts into being a good professor. And I remember my mentor would say, for every hour of class, you have to prepare 3 hours prior to class. So I would spend days prior to teaching, preparing for my class and do research and all that. And I got very, very turned off by the comment that my teaching ratings were suspiciously high. So I left that university and I decided to go to a teaching university. And a lot of people said, okay, that's a suicidal move. You just killed your career. And I was like, I killed my career by going after something that I want to do, which was teaching. And they're like, yeah, once you're on a teaching path, you'll never you'll never be sort of like prime time in academia. And I was like, it's fine. I had 19 jobs until now. If this is the 20th, so what?
Exactly.
And I want to reflect a little bit on this, because it is so hard for a young PhD graduate to figure out what's right and what's wrong and what do you want to do. And, this whole 10-year process is such a intense and petrifying experience. And it feels like if you don't get it, your entire life is going to be over. Dude, you're fine. I mean, you have a degree that only about 1% of the population in the world has it. You already probably know more than you get. It's a very employable degree. Please don't kill yourself over, metaphorically, hopefully not. But it's a big deal, but it's not the biggest deal. It's okay. If it doesn't happen, it's okay. And if your heart is not into this kind of publish or perish path, it's great. There's amazing universities out there who value teachers. Or, I hear this. I heard this a couple of times in my life. Not a lot, because people are afraid of me, but she's not an academic, she's a teacher. I was like, and you think that's offensive? Do you know that in India they say mother is God, father is God, teacher is God? I'm good.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So like I said, my first step was this this very much known university, and then I moved to a teaching university. And like I said, it was perceived that this is it. This is the end of my career. Nobody is going to be a dead end. I'm going to be 75 and still teaching a silly undergrad course, and it wasn't.
and I think one of the things that you started to do in there is you started teaching, but also kind of use this idea of action research, right? In there, because action research has become like a core part of what you have been doing for the past, years of your teaching, and everything that you've been doing. So tell us a little bit more about this action research, and why is there resistance to it, and what do you think that it should be perceived as?
So, like I said, the concept of action learning is a lot more popular. Obviously, MIT is sort of like the guru, if you want, of action learning, where students don't learn just from the theory, but they learn through mind and hand. Like the MIT motto is mens and manus, and MBA programs are designed with this concept of action learning. And like I said, in the world of business, now in your space, in the space of science, in the space of engineering, the space of medicine, action research is a given. Action learning is a given, because you have to. But in management, it's a lot harder. So I stayed connected with my academic mentor from MIT, Professor Charles Fine, who at that point, he was teaching at MIT Sloan, who at that point was sort of involved with an Indian business school, the Indian School of Business, ISB in India. And ISB was trying to recruit faculty from US to come and teach in the program. It was a brand new program. And the reason why I mentioned this connected to action research, MIT was brought in as an action learning expert. They were trying to build more action-based projects in the MBA curriculum for ISB. And Charlie brought me in sort of like the expert of what action learning looks like in real action. Because like I said, I just spent 3 years doing this action research project. So when we went to India, we both taught in India for 4 consecutive years, 1 year in Hyderabad and then 3 years in Chandigarh, in the Mohali campus. And even while we were there, both of us were very interested in getting to know the industry. We were interested in going and visit factories. I mean, I went to places in India that my Indian students tell me that they've never been, because it's like so untouchable. Like I went to a place called Chandigarh, which is considered to be, not Chandigarh. Chandigarh was where the school was, but I went to a place called Muzaffarnagar, and Muzaffarnagar has this sort of reputation of being a dangerous place, a place of, a lot of corrupt crime and mafia and things like that. And we actually ended up doing a research project with the community of Muzaffarnagar who came to MIT. We brought them PhD students to understand how to deal with pollution. So what I learned very quickly is that if you open your mind to building a real relationship with the industry, you create so much more value for both. And then my classroom was always very interesting because I would encourage my students to bring examples from the industries that they were experts in, or, that's the great thing about an MBA program, that people have experience by the time they come in the class. I would bring in experience. I would always bring in guest speakers. So I tried to create almost like a mini action research centric learning environment where even when I was at this, teaching college in Boston, we would learn, for example, about, let's say, I don't know, service management and assembly lines. And I would take my students to Starbucks. I'd be like, all right, you want to learn about service management? Let's watch how many coffees can a barista make, at what speed, at what cost, at what quality. And we would learn operations management by watching a barista. I would take my students to go to IKEA and understand how do you design a process flow. And I'm still getting messages 10 years later from my students who were in my undergrad class saying, I still think about IKEA and I still think about process flow when I go through there. And what I learned, this was a philosophy that I learned very early in life, that young children don't like vegetables. So what you need to do, vegetables are important. So you need to hide them in the mashed potatoes. That's how children eat nutrients, important nutrients.
Yes.
Adults are the same when it comes to learning. We don't like to learn through theory, or very few of us can afford to learn through theory. So what you need to do, you still want to teach it, but you need to hide it in mashed potatoes. So my teaching philosophy became, let me tell you stories that are the mashed potatoes that are hiding a lot of the theory that is not going to feel as dry, as intangible, as intimidating as whatever that is. So action learning and action research is nothing but bringing the reality of what you're trying to learn, what you're trying to understand, what you're trying to solve into the classroom, versus staying completely isolated and learning only from secondary data, which is valuable. I'm not saying it's not valuable, but I don't like this idea that this is sort of lowbrow, second class, only for people who are not good at statistical analysis.
Yes.
No.
Yes, absolutely. And it's very, very, a very incredible insight, really. So, and just to go back to what you're talking about here, and, kind of put it back to the context of entrepreneurship and, what you have been doing. So you had a startup effectively when you were in Romania, and then you realized effectively, you might not be as good as you're good at value creating, but you're not good at the business side. And then you kind of did this, even though you thought that you did this thing in the ski resort and you made it a success, which may be part of your learning as well. And then you took on another challenge, which was completely different. But then your next challenge is effectively going back to that entrepreneurship, saying, you know what, we're going to do something that is completely, let's say, mad.
Yes.
Let's do it anyway and see what happens.
If you thought that so far what I was doing is unconventional, let me throw the whale in. So while I was in Boston and I was teaching for MIT in India, I was a lecturer at MIT. I was visiting lecturer, and I was a professor at a different school. But because I had my interaction with MIT in India, and because I taught in India for MIT, I was invited to be part of a conversation that MIT Sloan was having with the Central Bank of Malaysia, who was looking for an academic partner to help them build a university, a business school to start with in Malaysia, that sort of models the Western educational system, specifically the MIT system, but targets Asia as not as a pipeline of students, but Asia as a pipeline of outcomes. So they wanted a global business school, students from all over the world that are interested to learn about Asia. And when they were recruiting faculty from MIT to be part of this startup, I mean, you have to realize that being a tenure faculty at MIT is like being the closest to God. It's like the best job in the world. Nobody tells you what to do. You're in a, in the best school in the world. I don't know how closer you can be to God. A lot of people actually think that they are God, right? It wasn't like there was a flocking of tenure faculty trying to get this job, right? Which is another thing about entrepreneurship, that you should always try to go where the barriers of entry are lower, or where the territories are unexplored, where the fear is high, right? So my mentor, Professor Charles Fine, was recruiting for Asia School of Business, and that was the first recruit. I was like, I'm in. How often can somebody say, I'm a professor who was part of building a university from scratch?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a handful of people in the world who are founding deans and founding presidents and of something brand new. And I thought, and by that point, I started doing research, like legitimate research in entrepreneurship. And I thought, this is called action research. Let's go back to the drawing board. I'm not going to do it just by reading 75 papers and finding the definition of entrepreneurship from 75 papers, but let me go and do it in action. So like I said, I was the second hire of the school, the first hire of the president / dean / CEO, Professor Charlie Fine, with whom by then I worked a lot. I worked in India. Like I said, he was my MIT mentor for my thesis. And we I mean, if I think about, it's been 8 years now, exactly 8 years. We went in with the idea, how hard can it be to build a university from scratch? Turns out it's very hard, extremely hard. It's one of the hardest things to do. And I know people say, what's the big deal? It's not as hard as building Google or building, mining company or building, I don't know, a Procter & Gamble. It's not easy because business schools and universities are there's a template.
Yes.
And we are part of a whole ecosystem. And you have to realize that if you want to do something different, you're going against an entire ecosystem. Like, try to hire tenure faculty in a startup. Let me just give you that premise. Who wants to come and be a tenure faculty in a startup? Like, what is tenure? Tenure means for life.
Yes.
If I tell you that this is a startup, for whom life are you going to be there for? The startup life, which we don't know is going to be longer than 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. Yes. Your life, I'm not sure you're going to be good enough to stay for a start. So it's a very complicated game, because you want to be different, but everybody around you is the same. So it's very complicated. And then what happened was, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation. You can hire professors because you don't have students, and you can't hire students. I mean, you can't attract students because you don't have faculty. So what do? It turns out you have to hire faculty who are not afraid of being more than faculty. Because in the first year, faculty have very little to do as faculty. I mean, yes, they have to prepare for courses and things like that. But we hired faculty who are willing to be secretaries, IT people, HR people, marketing people, corporate people. So we had to hire very, very entrepreneurial academics who are willing to sort of flex their generalist muscles and be more than just an academic in the beginning, right? And through this adventure, I keep telling people that I was, between a C and an O, put in any letter. And I was like, Chief Marketing Officer, for sure, I can be that for a while. Chief Operating Officer, sure, I can be that for a while. Chief Corporate, sure, I can be that for a while. I mean, I don't know how it is, but somebody's going to have to do it. And guess what? That made me an amazing expert in entrepreneurship.
Absolutely.
And now I teach entrepreneurship. I'm like, well, the theory says this. Some of the theory, it's legitimate. My practical experience with this, the practical experience of all the people that I talk to also says this. So, I have a lot more respect and a lot deeper understanding for what entrepreneurship is all about. And, since we're talking about books, I hope at some point I can tell you about the new book that I'm writing, which is about entrepreneurship. But once again, it informed me in ways that I don't know if 10 PhD programs could have informed me about this. So I spent 8 years in Malaysia. I just came back, like I said, 8 months. I returned back to Boston. Initially, I was supposed to be there for a year and a half, and then it turned into 2, and then into 4, and then into 6, and then COVID came. So, 8 years later, I finally came back.
I mean, just you effectively, as people say, you need misfits, right? Who go against the grain. I remember the story of I'm sure you know Professor Richard Feynman, who is a Nobel Prize winner, and I remember that he became part of this company who did quantum computing, and the first day he turned up, and people were like, "Well, what are we going to give this guy? Because what was he going to do?" It's like he was like asking, "Give me something to do. Like, can you go and get some white, the markers?"
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he went and got like all these, this kind of stuff, right? So it's people who want to like get, roll your sleeves up and get things done, right? So, and you need people like that, especially any startup, any organization. When you're building something, you really need that. And I was supposed to ask you about your books, but the conversation has been so interesting, I completely forgot, to be very honest with you. So just tell us about the next book. I was supposed to ask this from all guests, but I literally forgot. So please tell me about the next book that kind of had an impact on your life.
So I thought about, like I said, because I was such an avid reader, pretty much biggest impact that it was never a book. It was always the amount of books that I read. But from a business perspective, the first business book that I read, and I thought, there's a lot of truth in this, was actually a book read by my mentor, by Charlie Fine, and it was Clock Speed. It has a longer title. I don't remember the title, but it's Clock Speed. That's the primary title. And I read it multiple times, across times, especially when I was working with the industry, because it sort of always took me back to trying to understand the industry better than that. And Charlie was always very action learning centric too, and action research centric. So maybe that's why I liked it very, very much, because he was very relevant to my mindset and the way I thought about it. But even today, every now and then I get a chance to teach his content. And I still today find it very relevant, because he speaks about how you have to understand how each industry moves at a different speed, and how innovation, it's not equal across industries. And that really, really informed my understanding of education as an industry, because when I became part of Asia School of Business, and when I became an associate dean, and later on a senior associate dean, I had to think not just about my primary job, but I had to think about the industry and the ecosystem and the economy that we were playing in, because that's the job of a leader. The job of a leader is not just to look in their own yard and be like, all right, how do I manage this, my own business here? But the job of a leader is to think about the entire system that goes around you. And like I said, one interesting thing for us was to realize that our unconventional school, and my nickname given by my students is the unconventional professor.
Yes.
And the school became known as the unconventional school. And to realize that if we're trying to build an unconventional university in a world of conventional models, understanding more than just your own business, it's critical. So that's why this book was so influential for me for years. And like I said, I used it always as a almost like a decoding mechanism to figure out why it's so hard to do what we do, why when I deal with this industry is so much more different than this industry. And it also helped me be a much better professor, because when I had, the amazing thing about my career is I was so lucky to meet with so many different kind of industry experts. And I had over, this is not bragging at all, but 400 industries companies in different industries that I work with. And they are very different, but at the end of the day, they have a lot of things in common. So, it was impactful in many, many ways than one.
And just to ask about what you're talking about, and you mentioned, you talked about this a little bit before. So being unconventional and also part of being a taking an unconventional path or a less traveled path. What are some of the problems that you see in research as and academia in general? Because I feel that this is a common theme that has been for many people that I've spoken to, my professors and academics I've spoken to in this podcast, is that there are, especially if you're trying to do something conventional, maybe your path is easier compared to if you're trying to do something more different. And that made it more difficult to take risks.
Yeah.
And is that true, or it would?
I was just trying to find a quote here, but it's both ways. In the sense, being unconventional is very risky, and you have to really prepare yourself against a lot of backlash and a lot of, rejection and a lot of questioning of why do you have to be different. And let me just state this: there's levels of success in life. I am at the very small level of success. But when you speak to people who are extraordinarily successful, and I'm talking about people who had 2 Nobel Prizes, not 1, people who won, Beyonce won last night more Grammys than any other artist in the world, right? When you're an EGOT, when people who are truly extraordinarily successful, they will tell you that the reason why they are successful is because they chose the unbeaten path, the less beaten path, right? But they will also tell you about the struggles, the rejections, the refusal, the effect. And you also have to realize that it really messes you up as an individual, because you have to build a lot of emotional maturity to deal with all this rejection. So the thing, though, is that once this type of people, and once again, I don't mean me because I'm at the lowest level of success, when these people become successful, we glorify their success without realizing the amount of, lashes they have on their backs for all the, because it's so interesting. Humanity rejects everything else that is not uniform, that is not conventional. We go after everybody who's trying to do things differently until they become successful. And once they become successful, we glorify their authenticity, we glorify their unconventionality, we glorify their courage, we glorify, whatever they stand for. And I'm thinking, where were you when I was desperate for a hand? When I was like, well, because at that point it's perceived as rejection against majority rather than an expression of self.
Yes.
And my thing was never that I rejected academia. I mean, I worship academia, but it was more that I don't fit in the model that exists. And I wish that there were other models for people who are like me, who don't fit in the traditional path. And why is it that being just a teacher is perceived to be a third hand? Like, at the end of the day, I have thousands and thousands, I'm not kidding you, of emails from students saying, this is how you changed my life. This is valuable for me. I am happily dying tomorrow knowing that I created some positive value.
Reward,
now,
right? That's a major reward.
But there's also another reality of if you choose the beaten path, which is that also comes with a lot of rejection. That also comes with a lot of, the need for resilience and the need for grit, because the more you go for the traditional path, even though there's a roadmap, the blockages are higher because they have a very specific format. And if you don't fit in that format, you're out. Yes. So I look, for example, I have an extraordinary colleague of mine who chose the very formal path, and she had 35 papers by the age of 35, something like that. And it was amazing. And all her life, everything she did was from this lens. Will it be published? If it's going to be published, is it going to be in this paper? If it's going to be in this paper, will it have this impact? If it's going to have this impact, is it going to take me faster to an associate professor? And everything that was not part of that, she rejected it. So even though there were things that were interesting or opportunities that were unique, she said, no, this is not what the academia wants. I cannot do this. I can't get distracted.
Yes.
So they're both hard, but they both come, people say that life is full of compromises and I don't know if it's and sacrifices, because
Yeah.
especially a woman, I get this question. Please don't be banal and ask me what it's like to be a woman in this role, because this is the most stupid question ever. But you're always asked about your sacrifices, and I don't know if it's a sacrifice or a choice. It has to be a choice.
Yes.
But both choices come with a lot of pain, and this brings me to the third book, because you wanted me to reflect on something else that I read that really
thank you.
So,
thank you.
just trying to do your job here,
Yes,
which
exactly.
I apologize.
Exactly right.
But I actually, so I wrote this down because I want to make sure that I quote it. So this was not a book, but it was an article written by this guy called Mark Manson. Mark Manson is a publisher. He published the book The Art of Not Giving an F. And he wrote a lot of blogs. And one day I stumbled upon an article written by him that it's called The Most Important Question of Your Life. So once again, guys, if you're listening to this, Google it, The Most Important Question of Your Life. And when I read that, it was like, it wasn't a bulb light. It was like God came from above, cracked my head open, put all the enlightenment in my head, and finally life made sense. Because Mark says this: a lot of people say, I want to be happy and have a great family and a great job. It is so ubiquitous, it doesn't mean anything. You shouldn't ask yourself, what do you want out of life? A more interesting question is, what pain are you willing to suffer in life? What are you willing to struggle for? And this is what was formative for me. Don't be in love with the result only. Make sure that you are in love with the process.
Yes.
So let me just say this again. We all want to be superstars.
Yes.
Okay. My God is Jennifer Lopez. I don't think on this planet there's anybody who's better than Jennifer Lopez as a human. I want to be Jennifer Lopez, but I'm not willing to put 18 hours, 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, 300 and I don't know how many days a year to do what she does. You talk to athletes who say, I'm in the gym 5 times a day. You talk to authors who say, I write 18 hours a day and I rewrite and I rewrite. That's the process. The thing is that we only see the outcome. We only see the results. We see that Jennifer Lopez is a superstar. We see that, I don't know, Brady is the biggest athlete of all time. We only see outcomes.
Yes.
And when we see the outcome, we focus on the outcome without realizing what is the pain that you have to suffer to go through that outcome. And for me, I realized that different pain comes with different cost. And for me, the pain of being unconventional was a lot more tolerable than the pain of being conventional.
Yes.
And this is how I connect to the previous question, which is, which path is better? It's whatever path comes with a higher acceptance of the process, not the outcome. Because when people tell me now, wow, you're so successful, you're so confident, you're all this and that, I'm like, okay, you see the outcome.
Yes.
Are you willing to go through the process? For me, and maybe this is getting too personal, and feel free to take this off the podcast.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
But for me, this was a very personal question when it came to explaining why I don't want to have children, which is, once again, one of those cliche questions that everybody feels the need to ask a woman. They never ask a man. And for me, it was not that, oh, you don't like children, which is so banal. It's like, has nothing to do with that. I love to see the result of parenting. I'm not interested in the process of parenting.
Yes.
And that's why it's such a fundamental question for me that we should all think a little bit more about. If you're a graduate, if you're a PhD student, if you're somebody who's at the beginning of their career, don't think about the outcome only. Think about the cost of the process, and are you willing to deal with that process? Because that's going to be 99% of your life.
Yes. And it's going to be, for everything that, anything that you want to undertake, that's an extremely important question to ask regardless, right? So that's, And I would also add, there's another book called, I think it's called Power of Regret. So it kind of connect back to what you mentioned about, if I don't do this, if I don't go through this path, what is going to happen, right? That's an extremely great book as well. You probably have read it. It's a brilliant book. I loved it. And it talks about how Jeff Bezos decided to do Amazon versus, quitting his job. And he called it the regret minimization framework, right? But in the book, it goes further and talks about quite a different approach as well. So I really recommend that book because it's a great book. So we're coming to the end of the podcast, and we've gone over as well. So I apologize, but thank you so much. One thing I really want to ask you is I ask this from all the my guests, is that you've taken huge amount of steps over the past years, and you already you've written books and so on. So what is the next challenge you're undertaking? What is the next thing that is driving you right now?
So I wrote this book together with a few colleagues of mine called The Job is Easy, The People Are Not. It was never intended to be a book. That's why it doesn't read like a book. But one of the things I learned about being an author, a baby author, was that you learn more about the topic after you publish the book. So I'm very, very lucky that I had received a tremendous amount of requests to speak about the book. And I pretty much talk about the book 3 times a week now. And I learned so much more about the book. And then together with Professor Charlie Fine, who I have to say, he is probably the most instrumental person that an academic like me could have in life. And I know you usually ask this question to other colleagues, yes, but there's always somebody. You should pay attention that there's always somebody in your life that truly has
your back, as it were, right? Yeah.
Transformative role. And this person, for me, was Charlie Fine. But together with Charlie, we're trying to write a book on entrepreneurship, using our experience and using the sort of expertise that we developed in time working with industry, and that is called Nail It, Scale It, Sail It. And we actually have 85% of the book ready. It's just that the last 15% takes longer than the first 85%. So these are my 2 projects. So like I said, this project it's The Job is Easy, The People Are Not. I want to do a edit or a reprint. I don't know exactly. I want to revise some of the things because I learned a lot more after I wrote the book. And then hopefully, if anybody's listening and you're a good editor, give me a call. I need help. I'm very, very good, but I need help when it comes to the, serious things like sitting down and writing a book. But yes, so we have 2 books in process that I'm trying to, one revise and one publish.
Sure. All the details will be available in the show notes as well, and we will definitely provide all the links and details as well. So that'll be all in the website page and in the show notes. Just want to ask you the kind of final question that I usually ask, which is actually final 2 questions, but let's ask the first one first, which is, who would you like to thank? I'm sure that many people, like hundreds and thousands of people that have come and met you, and how you've helped, and they've helped you and so on. But I know Professor Charles Fine is an important part of your life. And tell me, if you had the opportunity, like anybody to thank, happy.
So yeah, let me just formally say that I really want to take a moment to acknowledge Charlie as a mentor. And the reason why I want to do this is there are very different type of mentors in life. And the type of mentor that I needed, and I didn't know that I need, was a mentor that said, if you want the unconventional path, you can do it. So it was a validation of my unconventionality. And not only that, but let me help you be even more unconventional than you thought that you can be. Because I had different mentors in life who would always tell me, no, this is too much. This is too, right? So you have to also be very specific about the type of mentor that you really allow in your life. So Charlie Fine was the type of mentor that encouraged my unconventionality, fed it even more, and gave me even more materials to actually do something about it. Because otherwise I could have just been somebody sitting on a top of a building and yelling that I want to be unconventional. I just don't know how. So thank you, Charlie Fine. Still today, we're actually going to teach next week together a class. So, you know, I'm going to be eternally grateful. And then I know this is going to sound like such a cliche, but I promise it's not. There's nothing cliche about me. But my students have had such an impact on my life, and they still do. For the first time ever, I'm teaching. Actually, no, I taught for a couple of years, but I'm teaching undergrad. And I was so scared to teach undergrad because they are babies and I don't know how to deal with them. But man, am I so grateful to them, because every day I go to class and I learn new things. And I'm thinking, isn't that amazing that somebody pays me to learn? And the way I learn from my students. And even today, I've been teaching for almost 15 years now. And tomorrow I'm excited to go to class because I know for a fact they're going to teach me something. So I'm very, very grateful to my students, and I really want to thank them. And pretty much everybody who was a student in my life once, know that I learned from you just as much as you learned from me. So thank you.
I mean, you know that you found your calling, your path, that when you're really looking forward to go to work tomorrow, right? So that's a evidence of that. And the final question is, if anybody want to contact you or talk to you, how would they do that?
Well, I say this as a joke, but Google me. I'm that famous. You can find me pretty much everywhere. So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So just search my name is Professor Loredana Padurean. I'm very active on Instagram. It's prof_Loredana. I also have a lot of videos on YouTube about the book, about the job is easy, the people are not. There's actually the book is based on interviews with colleagues of mine. So for every interview, there's a YouTube link. I'm in Boston at Northeastern. Come and knock on my door. I promise you, we're going to have a great coffee together. But I can be found literally everywhere. Just Google me. It's going to be that easy.
All the contact details and everything will be available in the show notes as well. So thank you very much. And final question to end the conversation: what is your final book?
The final book is the book that I'm writing now. That better be, because I'm not
consuming your life effectively.
Yes. And I have to say, through the process of writing books, you learn more than you can ever imagine, because you have to read everything else that was written on that topic. So you don't just generate yet another, repetition. But the next book is not just the job is easy, the people are not, but it's nail it, scale it, sail it. That's the next book.
Let's get it. Yes.
You have to hold me accountable for it, okay?
Absolutely. We will come back to you when the book is ready, and
okay.
hopefully we can have a chat again. So thank you, Professor. Really appreciate your time. We've gone over, and but I know you're super busy, so thanks again. I really appreciate your time. Thank you, and hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you, everybody.